All right. Morning, everyone. How you going? This week I finally finished the end of a 4-hour podcast. It did take a while. It took a number of walks to get it done, but it was one involving a guy by the name of Sean Ryan, and he interviewed a guy named Matt Bissonnette, who was one of the SEAL team operators in the Bin Laden raid a couple of years ago. And he shared some of the story, I guess, of warfare, of the cost of combat, the cost of life, and how it sort of for him all culminated in that operation that night in Pakistan. I certainly would not endorse it for anybody in the room, for anybody even under 18. But the guy spoke about faith, and I guess given my previous background and role, I'm fascinated by the way that God connects with people who are really, really down a dark path and has a way of pulling them back. And there's still lots of sanctification to be done in those guys, but I really like it on some level. Matt spent he sort of spent a lifetime, I guess, sharing about preparing for fighting in a real war and in different operations and everything else. But after he left, he wrote a book under an assumed name, basically sort of saying a couple of different things that the government hadn't said, and he found out that the government actually had it in for him a little bit because they wanted their narrative preserved, and his was so I guess his life was one of fighting one battle only to realise that there's actually a much bigger one that his future would involve. I've spent the last 3 weeks trying to just in the life of Elisha, just to get through our vision series. It's not the perfect fit, but I would really want to encourage you and ask and invite you, if you have not, if you've missed any of them, please go back and watch them, because I've tried to, I guess in a very big picture style, sort of put the future of the church before all of us together in those messages. The brief version is there's 3 posters on the wall if you didn't get to the other messages, and they're up on the screen as well. But I reckon there's one more message today about the practical journey ahead and how the church might together take the next step that God might be asking us to do. I'm not announcing anything remarkable this morning. Everyone okay? I've just been pondering, I guess, the similarities between the prophets of the Old Testament and the guys like SEAL Team 6 minus their guns, and maybe even that just sort of describes the life of Christians today in many respects. Okay, they live in a real world surrounded by real needs, with real issues and with real brokenness that only God can fill and fix. They live in the now of life with a clear hope and a vision of a kingdom that is better than the one that they've got, that will come one day in the person of Christ. And while they battle both in practical levels in front of what they see, they're also engaged in a second, much bigger battle on a spiritual level that I think all of us as God's people are called to fight. I'm going to call this, just for the sake of the argument, embracing the tension, like life in the tension, if you want to call it that. Okay, remember that God has moved Elisha from a place that he is familiar with, but he is bored by, to a very, very different role, a very, very different life, a very, very different perspective, and now with spiritual goalposts that don't always make sense and line up perfectly with the things of this world, which is something all of us, I think, live with when we come to faith. We're called to both live in and remain anchored in a real world where people feel empty, where people feel exhausted, but invited to walk in relationship with a life-giving God who promises to fill us each day to undertake his work and his mission in the world. But while we're here, we're not meant to stay comfortable, get comfortable, set up for the long term, and settle down. But I think to live longing for the day that God might do more in our day than what he has up until now. Let me just explain this way. It may be this way for the church. We are placed by God together here with a sense of calling and empowering for this moment here today in Wangaratta. Yeah? Alan, by the way, preached what I thought was a really amazing message a couple of months ago, talking about the way that God provided the church and the way that God built the church and the way that God put the church together and brought all these people together. And while it's important, I think we remember with gratitude the way that God has been faithful to us. And he has been faithful to us, amen? God has been extraordinarily faithful to his people, individually, collectively, over a lifetime. And it's important we remember and celebrate, I think on regular occasions, the way that he has done that and the way that he has proven himself faithful on so many levels. But I think we should also, at the same time, noticing the brokenness of our world, live with a holy discontent that God is not glorified the way that he is, or the way that he should be. And which I think should prompt us in a roundabout way to actually long to call on God and ask him as the faithful, covenant-keeping, loving Father that he is to show more and more of his glory in our day. I think Habakkuk said it this way: Lord, I've heard of your fame. Like, I've heard of all the stories of all the stuff you've done. I've heard of the glorious God you are and the way that you've rescued people. I stand in awe of your deeds. I'm grateful for what you've done, but repeat them in our day. In other words, I've read all these amazing things, but I long for more. And this is the tension I think that as God's people we sort of need to embrace, because life this side of eternity does not always make a great deal of sense. Everyone okay? Through uncertainty and through grief and through loss and everything else, we're called to live in gratitude for all that God has done through Jesus. I guess making a way for each of us through the cross to be set free, not to be called or labelled enemies of God, but to be called friends of God. I was hoping there'd be a little bit more excitement about that. Come on. And I think while we should live with a contentment of all that God has done until now, we should also be convinced to play our part and long for the day where God does more. And like I've shared in previous weeks, I think God's plans for Wangaratta are far bigger than just to build a big church and manage the stuff going on here. I'd be really interested to talk to you if you disagree. I think God's got something bigger for us than just managing a church and sitting here on Sunday. Can I just address something here personally that I think it's important you hear from me on occasion? And I'm just going to say it this way: this tension of the here but not yet just describes my existence as a pastor perfectly. Because you probably realise that I'm a reasonably passionate person. Everyone okay with that? I am somebody incredibly grateful that God has chosen to use me in any capacity that he has. I'm so grateful as a little kid at Nambour Baptist Church at the age of 13 that they said, you can come and help me do sound. And look what God said with yes. Yeah? God has already done in me so much more than I could ever deserve. So much more than I could ever dream of. And it is a privilege, it has been a privilege to watch God over recent years help us together grow and begin praying people into the kingdom. There's nothing I like better. And you need to know that as a pastor, I like the prophets, am quite content with where God has got us. Okay? But as somebody who honestly has only seen a little part of the God I read about in the Old Testament and the New Testament, I long for him to do a whole heap more than he has yet. And I'm aware that sometimes passion comes across as critique. I wrestle with this more than you know. And I think I need to spell out on occasion and just put out there for the church sometimes that you need to know that I am not critical of where we are. I'm not critical of anybody in the church. I'm not critical of the way that anyone's done anything or doing anything or what God has done to this point. But I hope at the same time you can appreciate that I will keep lovingly calling God's people and us together to pursue something greater than what we've done up until now. Does that make sense? And I will lovingly, where I need to, with all of the grace I can muster, ask us just to shift our focus a little bit from where it has been to something that allows God to do more in our midst. And I hope sometimes you can make sense of that tension that I live in day by day by day, where you can't be content with what you've seen of God, but you long for him to do more. And if that doesn't make sense and I haven't said it right, please come talk to me. I just think it's really important that as somebody who is reasonably passionate, I've got to tell you that I'm okay with where we are, but I'm not okay with staying here. Does that make sense? Let's talk about number 2, a sensitivity to God's Spirit, because I think when you read prophets, when you read Elisha's story, it just strikes me he's always in the right place at the right time. Have you noticed that? He's always in a different place too. When you read the scripture and you read the story, he's in this place, and then he's over in this place, and then he's in that place, and there's probably years and stuff in between. Okay, but he always seems to be right where God needs him. Okay. But to live that way, yes, one, you need a commitment and a desire to live for his glory, but you've also got to have a daily sensitivity to God's Spirit and committed to listening to him perhaps more than we normally do. You see, Scott McKnight is a Bible scholar who tells us that the word listen is mentioned 1,500 times in the Bible, mostly in the context of us listening to God, not the other way around. And God's most regular critique of his people is this: they will not listen to me. Okay? And I guess what we see in Elisha's life, and I think what God longs for in our lives today, is to be people who are familiar with listening to and aware of his leading in that small, still voice. Okay? Now for the people who sit here today and you're like, you know what, that on some level I would love to have the freedom that Elisha seems to have, because I just feel so burdened being here, surrounded by what I've got to do, surrounded by all of the commitments I've got, and this is just maybe how life is. It sounds really good, doesn't it, to be able to go and live like a carefree life like the prophet. He just looked as though he was able to be going wherever God needed him. Okay, I just want to suggest to you that irrespective of what life brings to you and where life might have brought us, we can still be people, irrespective of where we are, who are listening to God's Spirit and are willing to be led by God's Spirit if we will just make space for him. But I think perhaps the reason we find this so hard is just because humanity has always defaulted to doing rather than listening. I find this fascinating. A guy by the name of E.M. Bounds wrote this about 100 years ago, well before we would talk about and think about the modern demands of the pace of life, right? This is his words, and he does use a couple of big words. So if anybody needs to get a thesaurus out and sort of make sense of this, I'm just going to ask for your help. But I don't understand it, but I'm just going to read it. All right? Check this out. 100 years ago, yeah? The tendency of these times is to an ostentatious parade of doing which enfeebles the life and dissipates the spirit of prayer. And if I can just jump over to Jesus for a minute, I think Jesus was the one who got this right. If you want some homework this week, yes, there is homework some weeks. In Mark chapter 1, you have a story where there's almost a near revival going on. Like Jesus is healing people left, right, and centre. There's a crowd beginning to join. There's people coming all over the place. His message about the kingdom is going forward. And on every measure of human success, it looks as though he's ticking all the boxes. But after getting up one day early and praying, he senses his father say it's time to go. And he leaves behind every success and he says, I'll go with you. And I've just got to be honest with you, during the week, it is so easy to come to God with a list of prayer needs which are important, but it's not nearly as important as listening to what God is trying to say to me. I so get that wrong. Repeatedly, regularly. And I know I'm not the only person who does that. So I guess to bring this back to our circumstances and our journey forward, I just want to suggest again, the church has to run at a different pace than every other organisation in the world. It can't function with busyness. It can't function at fever pitch. It can't function at panic. It's got to function by letting God lead it. And I've realised more and more and more and more how important it is in some places to slow parts of the church down and to build more and more of our space in our calendar for God to lead his church at the pace of grace. Which probably at the same time leads me to the last point, which is just this. Living in constant faith. Which is always being ready to move when God calls. Because you can't sit and pray all day. You've actually got to be prepared to move when God says it's time to move. And if you consider, I guess, the life of the prophets, there is no moment that they live in where they feel in control. There is no moment, at any moment, that Elisha goes, I've got everything I need and I can keep pouring out all the stuff that I've got. Okay? Each time he finds a need, he has to go to God and ask him to fill the container or to fill this life. And I just have a picture in the minds of these prophets, which is sort of like a mindset of this. If God doesn't show up here, I'm done for. Day after day after day after day after day. Have you noticed that God tends to just give you enough to get to here and then says, would you just take one more step into the unknown, past a line that you never thought was possible before, and just trust that I'll provide for you there as well? If you don't, I'm not sure you're living the Christian life. Okay? And especially, I think for us as a church, as we get into some of those discussions about and plans of growing pains and the future, I just want to suggest to you, let's not be afraid of the obstacle in front of us. Let's not be fearful of what is in front of us and how it's all going to work or what's going to happen or what changes might be necessary or how it's going to impact what I think and everything else. But just start in prayer and let God lead his church. But at the same time, when he says move, it's time to move. Okay? I've probably shared this before. We should, I think, in any given church have at any given time in our history, be able to have a long list of a testimony of occasions where on a human level we were uncertain or not sure, or what seemed like things were impossible until God showed up. I would like to think that that is the testimony of every church, just trusting God to do things well and truly beyond what we are capable of. And today I think God still longs for a generation of people who will seek him in faith and prayer and join him in his work, in a life of service to others and to his church, knowing that without faith it is impossible to please God, because everyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. I just want to suggest to you that as a church, it probably wouldn't hurt us to stop and remember sometimes all of the ways that we got to the end of ourselves only to see God take over. Just to link that, everything that I've shared so far is not related to the Bible reading. I get that. I'm sorry, right? Just to briefly link that back to today's passage. This passage opens our eyes, I think, to something much larger that is going on beyond the natural world. And we do tend to, maybe bigger than what we just tend to see with our own human understanding. Because let's face it, most of us as humans tend to see everything in a church by the quality of the music, the quality of the kids' service, the number of seats taken every Sunday, and the quality of the sermon, which you're going to fail with me every week. All right, I'm sorry. Okay, but there is actually a much larger cosmic battle going on that we are invited into as God's people. Okay, where the people outside of here are not the enemy, they are the prize, they are the mission. Where our kingdoms are not important, but his kingdom desperately is. Where the thwarting of our plans doesn't matter, but the thwarting of the evil one's plans is really important. And where our role in the battle on an earthly level matters, but maybe the fighting done in the quiet places of prayer is probably far more mighty and influential than we ever think. And I guess the phrase that really just captures my attention in that reading, that I would love for you to read and grasp as we are in our church today, just is Elisha's proclamation. There are more on our side than there are on theirs. And he says the next thing, which is, Lord, open his eyes and let him see. I would say to you, open your eyes and let us see what God wants us to do. I have battled all week knowing how to finish this message. I'm just going to try with these two things. I probably have shared a lot of information in the last month, and I'm really happy I'm not preaching next weekend. I've talked about, I guess, if you want to boil those posters down to three things, it's ultimately about loving God, loving others, and living on the mission. That's the really simple version of that, okay? But I would just love to sort of summarize, I guess, some of the key parts of the measures and the things I think God longs for in the lives of his people, and maybe this matters for us in our church. Very briefly, steadfast faith. But people who faithfully follow where God might take us, even though we're not quite sure of what tomorrow brings, knowing that he's already there. Joel said it before, humble service. Every part of the body has a role to play. And if there's one part of the body that's not functioning, that's not a healthy thing, right? And I think what I just say to you is I think with the exception of Bible reading on a Sunday morning, there is probably every other area in the church that could deal with that could happily have more people attached to it. People humbly doing their bit for others. And I think it simply just starts with this. If somebody helps a new family in the car park, makes a connection and walks in the door with them, you've probably done a whole bunch more than I can. It ain't about the people up here. It's about all of you together. I want to just talk about loving generosity, people who will live generously with all of themselves and all of what God has given them. Unceasing worship, keeping Jesus at the center of it all, keeping the focus on Him, keeping our eyes on Him. Fervent prayer, just embracing the fight against the forces of darkness or the forces of ignorance or apathy or selfishness that sort of try to hinder what God is trying to do. And I think the last one that I just would love us to grab hold of is certain victory. We tend to, as Christians, know a lot about victory and know that it's going to come one day, but we spend a lot of our time today living like there's no victory at all. And I just want to suggest to you that the invitation before God's people today is in a world of endless distractions and things that fight for our attention, to lift our eyes and fix them on Jesus. Second and probably last, this is all I'll say, that the constant theme of Elisha and his life is God's promise to fill empty containers and empty lives and empty spaces with all of Him. And I probably can't not finish this series again without saying to you again that if you are a Christian and you look at your life and you look at some of those, at the those 6 things that I just listed there before, and you say, you know what, I'm not sure that I've got any of those things in my life the way that I would like to, and I wish I had more. Then why not ask God to lift your eyes, to fill you again with Himself, and to embrace the calling of life that He wants to give. And if today you have come with somebody, or you're here by yourself, and your life is empty and longing for more, Jesus longs to fill you. If you will empty yourself and you turn from your sin, if you will give up the life that you have and give it to Him, and if you will receive all that He wants to give. I'm going to invite the worship team to come. And speaking of just making things line up that didn't line up before, I didn't have anything to pray about at the end here, and now I understand why, because Lorraine's on prayer, and I'm going to ask Lorraine to come and lead us in prayer, because I think the less I say in this moment is probably better.